Suddenly, without warning, the rope snapped. "Hold on!" John yelled, but it was too late. The rope had broken, and Belka's body lurched down further into the pit. Emma gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. John's heart stopped. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The rope had been their last chance, and now they were back at square one. The cow was stuck, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing with it an oppressive heat, it became clear that time was running out. Chapter 1. The morning scented with hay. The sun was still low in the sky when John rose from bed, the faint scent of hay and earth drifting in through the open window. It was the kind of morning that belonged to a world of simple things. The soft rustle of leaves, the quiet chirping of birds, and the steady rhythm of farm life. He stretched his arms over his head and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the warmth of the room seep into his bones. "Another day," he muttered to himself, pushing the covers off his legs. His joints creaked slightly as he swung his feet onto the cool, worn floorboards. At 67, John had never felt his age more acutely than in the early mornings, when his body begged for just a few more moments of sleep. But there was no time for that now. The cows would need milking, the pigs would need feeding, and the garden needed tending. He couldn't afford to waste a minute. He pulled on his boots, which had long since molded to his feet, and grabbed his old flannel shirt from the chair by the bed. He stood for a moment in the dim light of the room, looking out the window at the peaceful expanse of farmland stretching out before him. It was a quiet, rugged life, one that he and Emma had built together over the years. Despite the hard work, there was a certain tranquility in the routine of it all. He could hear her moving around in the kitchen, the clink of pots and the sizzle of something cooking already. Emma was always up before him, a creature of habit and care. She would have already fed the chickens, checked on the rabbits, and prepared breakfast. Her energy, even in her 60s, never seemed to waver. John admired that about her. As he stepped outside into the cool morning air, the familiar scent of hay and earth filled his nostrils, grounding him in the moment. The light was still soft, the world just waking up. In the distance, he could see their small herd of cows grazing lazily near the barn, their thick coats gleaming in the first rays of the sun. John made his way to the barn, where he would begin the morning ritual of milking Belka, the older cow. She was the matriarch of the herd, a reliable and calm presence that had been with them for many years. She recognized his footsteps and raised her head as he entered the barn, greeting him with a soft moo. John smiled, reaching out to stroke her gently along the side of her neck. "Morning, girl," he murmured, his voice soft. "Let's get you sorted." He set up the milking stool, his movements automatic as he adjusted the bucket beneath Belka. The sound of milk splashing into the metal was soothing, a familiar rhythm that filled the barn with comfort. The smell of fresh hay mixed with the warm scent of the milk, creating an atmosphere of simplicity and peace. Meanwhile, Emma was already outside, tending to the pigs. She had always been the one to care for them, her soft voice cooing at the animals as she refilled their water troughs and scattered grain across the ground. The pigs snorted happily, digging in the dirt and rolling around in the mud, oblivious to the world around them. Emma smiled as she worked, her hands steady and sure, used to the repetitive motion of farm life. The geese, too, were making their usual racket, honking loudly as they waddled toward the pond. The ducks joined them, eager for a swim in the cool water. Emma laughed, a soft, rich sound, as the geese began chasing each other around, flapping their wings in mock aggression. "I swear, these birds are more trouble than they're worth," she said to herself, shaking her head. But there was a fondness in her voice, a soft affection for the animals that made up their little farm family. She reached down to pat one of the pigs on the head, her fingers grazing its rough, bristled fur. "Well, as long as you're happy." Back in the barn, John finished milking Belka, patting her gently on the side as he stood up and stretched his back. "All done for now," he said. Belka gave him a final look, as if to say, "Thank you," before she ambled back into the barnyard, joining the others. John wiped his hands on his worn jeans and headed for the house, where the smell of breakfast was growing stronger. Emma would have already made their usual meal: eggs, toast, maybe some fresh vegetables if she'd had time to gather them. Their breakfast was always simple but satisfying. It was a comfort, a small ritual they had shared for years. As he entered the kitchen, Emma looked up from the stove, her eyes warm and welcoming. Her silver hair, tied back in a loose bun, framed her face in a way that only added to her timeless beauty. She was still spry for her age, and her hands moved with practiced grace as she flipped the eggs in the pan. "Morning, love," she said with a smile. "You finish up with Belka?" "Yeah," John replied, easing into his usual seat at the table. "She's good for now." Emma set a plate in front of him, the warm food filling the air with the earthy scent of freshly cooked eggs and toasted bread. She sat down across from him, her eyes briefly meeting his before she started to eat. "Everything all right with the animals?" she asked, her voice a steady comfort in the quiet kitchen. "Yeah, everyone's fine. The pigs are happy, the cows are grazing." "But," John hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "I've been thinking." "About what?" Emma asked, raising an eyebrow as she chewed her toast. "Well," John said, his voice growing more serious, "I think it's about time we dug a new one." Emma stopped mid-bite, her eyes meeting his with concern. "Is it really that bad?" "I'm afraid so," he replied, setting down his fork. "The water's been getting lower, and if this summer's as dry as the last one, we might be in trouble." Emma didn't respond immediately, but John could see the concern in her eyes. They had lived here for so many years, and the land had been good to them, but they both knew that nature could be unpredictable. It seemed that the weather was becoming more erratic with each passing year. "We'll have to do it soon," John continued, "before it gets any worse." Emma nodded slowly, her thoughts clearly already turning over the logistics of it all. "Well, we'll manage," she said after a moment, her voice calm. "We always do." John gave her a small smile. "We do." The rest of the morning passed in quiet routine, feeding the geese, checking on the rabbits, tending to the garden. The hours slipped away like the steady beat of a drum, each task falling into place. But as John worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was a dryness in the air, a subtle heaviness that seemed to hang over the land, despite the brightness of the day. The earth beneath his feet felt harder than it should have, and when he glanced toward the old well, he noticed that the water level had dropped again, more quickly than he had anticipated. That evening, after a simple supper, John sat outside, watching the stars begin to emerge in the dusky sky. The day had been long, and he felt the weight of his age pressing against him more than usual. His hands were sore from the work, and his mind kept circling back to the thought of the well. The weather was changing, and he wasn't sure if they could keep up with it. As he sat there, the soft sound of wind rustling through the trees, he couldn't help but wonder, would they be able to handle whatever was coming? And in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered, "Asterisk, you have to start digging, John. Soon, asterisk." Cliffhanger. That night, as the wind picked up and the stars flickered above, John heard a strange noise coming from the direction of the barn. A creaking sound, like the earth itself was shifting. He stood up, his heart suddenly racing. Something was wrong. Chapter 2. A fateful step. The next morning dawned brighter than the last, though the air carried with it an uneasy weight. John had been up early, just as he always was, and had started digging at the well before the sun had fully risen. The soil was dry and tough, resisting every strike of the shovel. But that didn't deter him. If anything, it only hardened his resolve. Emma had always said that when things got tough, John was at his best. He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and took a deep breath. There was something unsettling about the soil today, something off. As he dug deeper, the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet, softening unexpectedly in certain spots, while other places felt unnaturally firm. He frowned, gripping the shovel's handle tighter. The dry earth crumbled in strange ways, as if it had been disturbed long before. "That's odd," he muttered to himself. "Don't remember it being like this last time." His mind wandered briefly to the many tasks that lay ahead. Feeding the animals, checking on the garden, and fixing the fence. The last thing he wanted was more trouble, but the land had always given them warning signs. Small clues that they had learned to pay attention to. The earth, the sky, and the wind had a way of speaking if you knew how to listen. John was just about to continue when he heard a loud rustling behind him. Turning quickly, he caught sight of Emma, moving briskly across the yard with purpose. "John, you should take a break," she called out, her voice laced with concern. "The sun's already up, and you've been at this for hours." He didn't reply immediately, choosing instead to inspect the strange softness of the earth beneath his feet. It almost felt wrong, as if something was waiting underneath. "John?" He finally turned to face her. "I'm just trying to get the water situation sorted," he said, his voice tense. "I don't like how the well's been dropping. We can't afford to wait any longer." Emma took a few steps closer, her worn boots crunching on the dry ground. She didn't say anything at first, simply studying her husband's face. She knew him too well to argue when his mind was set on something, especially when it came to the land. After a long pause, she spoke. "You're right, it's been too dry. But maybe it's time to call for help? We've never dug a new well ourselves." John shook his head. "We'll figure it out, Em. We've always managed before." But even as he said it, doubt lingered in the back of his mind. They were no strangers to hard work, and they had made do with less for most of their lives. But the land was changing, and there was an ominous sense in the air that they couldn't ignore. Emma glanced down at the ground where he had been digging. Her expression softened. "Just don't overdo it, love. I'll take care of the animals, but you—" Her words were cut off by a sudden noise, the unmistakable sound of hooves clattering against the hard ground. Both of them turned instinctively toward the barn, where their herd of cows was grazing. But something wasn't right. Belka, the older of their two cows, had wandered closer to the hole where John had been digging. She stood at the edge of the pit, sniffing at the loose soil with curiosity, her big brown eyes wide and innocent. "Belka, no!" Emma shouted, her voice sharp with alarm. John's heart skipped a beat. He had always trusted Belka, who was calm and steady, but she was a curious creature, prone to getting too close to things she shouldn't. And right now, the ground beneath her was unstable. Before he could say anything, Emma started to run toward the barn, shouting to the cow, trying to scare her away from the edge. But it was too late. The earth, already weakened from John's digging, gave way beneath Belka's feet. The cow let out a startled moo and slipped sideways, tumbling into the hole. "Belka!" Emma screamed, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. John was already on his feet, rushing toward the edge of the pit. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct in his body screamed for him to act. "Belka, are you all right?" he called, his voice tight with panic. The cow lay in the bottom of the pit, legs splayed awkwardly beneath her. She was breathing heavily but seemed to be unharmed, though clearly frightened. Her large brown eyes met John's, filled with fear. But she didn't struggle, just lay there, waiting for someone to help her. "Emma!" John called out urgently. "Get the rope. We need to get her out of there now." Emma didn't hesitate. She sprinted back to the barn, her face set in a mask of determination. Meanwhile, John tried to assess the situation. The hole wasn't deep, maybe only 6 feet or so, but the sides were steep, and Belka's size made it impossible for her to climb out on her own. John knelt down at the edge, looking down at the cow. "It's all right, girl," he whispered, his voice low and soothing. "We're gonna get you out of here. Don't you worry." The sun beat down on him as he worked, sweat dripping from his brow. The ground was dry, the air thick and still, but his hands worked quickly, moving with practiced urgency. Emma returned with the rope, a sturdy length of thick, weathered cord that had been used many times before. Together, they tried to secure it around Belka's chest, hoping to use it to pull her free from the pit. John's hands were shaking slightly as he tied the knots, his mind racing through the possibilities. They could try to pull her up, but there was always the chance that the rope would snap, or worse, that the cow would panic and injure herself. "Ready?" Emma asked, her voice strained but calm. "Ready," John replied, his voice tight with fear. They both tugged on the rope, pulling it taut. Belka, however, didn't seem to understand what was happening. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to stand, but the weight of the soil and her own confusion made it difficult for her to move. "We're going to have to be careful," John said, his voice low. "We can't rush this. If we pull too hard, we could hurt her." But as he spoke, the ground beneath Belka seemed to shift once again. The rope strained in their hands, and the cow let out a distressed moo, as if she knew what was at stake. The tension in the air was palpable, and John felt his heart beat in his throat. Time was running out. There was only so much they could do before Belka's struggle wore her down. Suddenly, without warning, the rope snapped. "Hold on!" John yelled, but it was too late. The rope had broken, and Belka's body lurched down further into the pit. Emma gasped, her eyes wide in disbelief. John's heart stopped. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The rope had been their last chance, and now they were back at square one. The cow was stuck, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing with it an oppressive heat, it became clear that time was running out. *cliffhanger* with no immediate solution, and Belka's situation worsening, John and Emma stood helplessly at the edge of the pit. The silence between them was deafening, filled only with the sound of the cow's anxious breathing. Would they find a way to rescue her before it was too late? Chapter 3. The Weight of the Sun. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a brutal, unrelenting heat over the farm. John and Emma stood at the edge of the pit, watching Belka struggle to find a comfortable position. Her eyes, wide with anxiety, flickered between them as if she was asking for help. But there was nothing they could do in that moment. "She's getting weaker," John muttered, his voice raw with frustration. "We need to do something, Em." Emma nodded, her face pale under the scorching sun. She wiped the sweat from her brow, glancing back toward the barn where their other animals waited, unsettled by the commotion. Her heart ached for them too, but Belka needed her more right now. "We can't leave her like this," Emma said, her voice steady despite the panic she felt rising in her chest. "Let's think this through." John ran his hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. If they didn't act quickly, they could lose the cow. His heart clenched at the thought. Belka wasn't just a cow to him. She was part of the family. They had raised her from a calf, tended to her through every season, and had relied on her for milk that had fed them through the leanest of winters. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her now, especially over something so simple, something they should have caught earlier. "We could try again with the rope," he said, his eyes scanning the area. "Maybe find something stronger, a pulley system or—" "No," Emma cut him off, shaking her head. "If we try that again, we risk making it worse. We need to think of something else." John's shoulders sagged as he considered her words. He felt powerless. The weight of the situation pressed on him, making the heat unbearable, almost suffocating. And in the back of his mind, he knew that the longer they waited, the harder it would be for Belka to survive the ordeal. Think, he muttered under his breath. The ground had already given way once, and any more attempts could destabilize the pit even further. Emma moved toward him, her expression soft but resolute. "John, we can't do this alone. We need help." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. John's heart clenched at the thought. He hated asking for help. Their pride, especially in matters like this, had always kept them independent, reliant only on each other. But he couldn't ignore the growing panic creeping in. "Who would we even ask?" John asked, his voice strained. "I'll go," Emma said quietly, her eyes hardening with determination. "I'll go to town and get someone. The neighbors, the town vet, someone who can help us. We can't risk waiting any longer." John was about to protest, but Emma had already turned on her heel, moving toward the small wooden gate that led off the property. He watched her for a moment, her back straight, her steps purposeful as she made her way toward the road. She didn't look back. He wanted to stop her, to tell her it was unnecessary, that they could figure it out together. But deep down, he knew she was right. There was no time to waste. He glanced down at Belka, still struggling in the pit, and his heart sank. Emma walked quickly, her boots crunching on the dry earth as she made her way down the dusty road that led into town. The air was thick with heat, the ground cracked and barren from weeks without rain. The sounds of birds and insects were muted, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. The town was a small, tight-knit place, and despite the occasional argument or gossip, people looked out for each other. But the drought had made everyone tense, and resources were scarce. Emma knew it would be hard to find help, but she was determined to try. For Belka, as she reached the main road that wound through the town, she noticed the state of the crops and gardens. The once lush fields were withering, the trees drooping under the unrelenting sun. Even the animals, visible in the few yards she passed, looked tired and thirsty, their coats dull from the lack of water. She knocked on the door of the town vet first. The building was small, tucked between a pair of unassuming houses, but it had always been their go-to place for animal care. When she knocked, there was no answer at first, but she could hear movement inside. After a long pause, the door opened slightly, revealing a man she didn't recognize. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice flat, his eyes tired. His face was weathered, a testament to years of working under the harsh sun. But there was an underlying frustration there that caught Emma's attention. "Please, it's my cow," Emma began, her voice urgent. "She's stuck in a hole on our property. We've tried everything, but—" The man held up a hand to stop her. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "The drought's hit us hard. I've got my own animals to worry about. I can't help you right now. You're going to have to figure it out yourself." Emma felt a surge of panic. The vet had always been reliable in the past, and now, when they needed him most, he was turning them away. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "It's not just any cow. She's been with us for years. You have to help her." The man's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "I understand, but I've got my hands full, too. You're not the only one suffering from this drought, ma'am." Emma felt a rush of helplessness flood over her. She was standing here, asking for help, and it was being denied. She wanted to scream, to argue, but instead, she forced herself to nod and step back. "Thank you anyway," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. As she walked away, she felt the weight of her failure press down on her. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. But where else could she turn? The rest of the town was struggling too. Everyone had their own problems. What could they possibly offer her in this situation? Emma's mind raced as she made her way back down the road, the weight of the problem growing heavier with each step. The sound of the distant cows calling out for attention seemed to echo in her mind. They needed water too, and the dry fields weren't going to provide it. And then, like a sudden gust of wind, an idea struck her. *cliffhanger*. Emma's eyes widened as a new thought surged through her mind. Could she still save Belka without outside help? Was there a way, hidden right in front of her, that could turn everything around? Chapter 4. Time running out. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows on the dry earth. The sky above was an unbroken expanse of blue, offering no promise of the rain they so desperately needed. Emma walked back toward the farm with a heavy heart, the weight of the morning's events dragging her every step. She had come up empty-handed in town. The vet had refused to help, and the townspeople, caught in their own struggles, had little to offer. Her mind was swirling with frustration and helplessness. She knew Belka's situation was getting worse. The cow had been stuck for hours now, and the heat only seemed to make things harder. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she imagined the exhaustion and fear in Belka's eyes. The cow had been with them for so long, and they had always managed to keep her safe. But now everything was falling apart. By the time Emma reached the farm, the midday heat was unbearable. She could see John, still standing near the pit, his back bent and his shoulders slumped. His face was shadowed by a deep frown, his gaze fixed on Belka, who was still struggling in the pit. He didn't look up when Emma approached, and for a moment, the silence between them felt like a heavy weight pressing down on both of them. "John," Emma said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. "I couldn't get anyone. The town's too busy trying to survive this drought. No one's got time to help us. John didn't reply immediately. His eyes were fixed on the pit, his mind racing through all the possible solutions, each one more difficult than the last. His hands were shaking from exhaustion, but he didn't acknowledge it. His only focus was on Belka. "We can't leave her there," he said at last, his voice rough. "But what are we going to do? We've tried everything, and we don't have the strength to do it alone." Emma's heart sank as she looked down at her husband. She could see the toll the past few hours had taken on him. His clothes were soaked through with sweat, his face drawn and tired, but his determination was still there, beneath it all. He wouldn't give up, not without a fight. Then, in a quiet, almost absent tone, John spoke again. "Maybe we could dig at the sides. If we widen the pit, she might be able to get out on her own." Emma's brow furrowed as she processed his words. "But the soil is so loose already, John. If we keep digging, it could collapse entirely." John's face twisted in frustration. "I don't know, Em. I'm just trying to think of something. Anything." Emma's eyes fell to the ground, searching for some sort of answer. They were running out of time. The situation was growing more critical by the minute, and she could feel the weight of it bearing down on her chest. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. As she stood there, something in the back of her mind clicked. She looked back toward the barn, her mind racing through the tasks she had been doing earlier. There had to be something they hadn't thought of. Some way they could fix this. Suddenly, it hit her. "John!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with sudden urgency. "The old cart. We could use the wheels to create a pulley system. We can lift her out of the pit. Slowly, carefully. We don't need to dig anymore. We just need a way to get her out without pulling too hard on the rope." John's eyes widened as he took in the idea. It was so simple, yet they had both been too consumed with the gravity of the situation to see it. "The cart?" John repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Why didn't I think of that sooner?" Without wasting another second, they set to work. John hurried to the barn, while Emma went to find some sturdy rope. She gathered all the supplies they could possibly need, all the while keeping her eyes on Belka, still trapped at the bottom of the pit. When John returned with the cart, Emma was already uncoiling the rope. The cart, an old wooden contraption they'd used for hauling feed and hay in the past, was just what they needed. The wheels were large and sturdy, and they could use them to create a makeshift pulley system strong enough to support Belka's weight. The plan was simple, but it was also their last hope. They would attach one end of the rope to the cart and the other to the cow, then use the wheels to slowly, carefully pull her out of the pit. John set to work, attaching the rope securely to the cart. "I'll need you to guide Belka, Em," he said, his voice focused. "If she panics, she'll only make it worse." "I'll do my best," Emma said, her voice tight with worry. She walked over to the edge of the pit, kneeling down beside the cow. She could hear Belka's shallow breathing, feel the animal's fear. But Belka was calm, for the moment, and Emma gently stroked the cow's head, speaking softly to her. "Everything's going to be okay, Belka," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. "We're gonna get you out. Just hang on." John moved quickly, securing the pulley system to the cart. He glanced over at Emma, his expression hard with concentration. "Are you ready?" he asked. Emma nodded, swallowing her fear. "I'm ready." The sound of the cart's wheels creaked under the strain as they slowly started to turn, the rope tightening with every movement. Emma kept her eyes on Belka, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones, trying to keep the cow calm as the tension mounted. The minutes stretched on, the strain of the effort wearing them both down. The heat was unbearable, and their bodies ached with exhaustion, but they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close. As the rope tightened further, Emma could feel the first signs of movement. Belka was shifting, her hooves scraping against the dirt. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the cow began to rise. John gritted his teeth, pulling on the rope with all his strength, his hands raw from the effort. Then suddenly there was a shift. The ground gave way again, and Belka lurched forward, the rope slipping from her side. "No!" Emma screamed, her heart leaping into her throat as she reached for the rope. John lunged forward, desperately trying to regain control. The cart tilted dangerously, and for a split second, it seemed like everything was about to collapse. But then, just as suddenly, the tension broke. Belka gave one final, powerful push, and with a grunt, she was free. Emma fell to her knees beside the pit, gasping for air, as John stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. Belka stood, shaky but standing, her breathing labored, but alive. *cliffhanger*. Emma reached out to touch Belka, her hands trembling, relief flooding her chest. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The sky had darkened, and in the distance, the first sign of a storm was stirring. But it wasn't rain they saw. It was something much worse. Something that would test their strength once again. Chapter 5. The Thirst of the Land. The faint hum of the wind was the only sound that filled the air as Emma and John stood next to Belka, both of them panting, their bodies drenched with sweat. The cow, weak and shaky, seemed to steady herself, her large eyes soft with a combination of confusion and relief. Her hooves scraped the dirt as she tried to adjust to her new footing, the first steps after hours of struggle. John's hands were covered in grime, his back aching from the hours of digging and pulling. Yet, as he stood there, looking at Belka, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. They had done it. She was free. She would survive. But the victory, sweet as it was, felt hollow in the heat of the relentless sun. It wasn't just Belka they needed to worry about anymore. Emma wiped her brow and turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sky was changing, dark clouds gathering, swirling together in the distance. There was no rain in the air yet, but the oppressive humidity was unmistakable, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something worse to unfold. It wasn't the storm they had hoped for, though. No, this was a different kind of storm. The drought had been eating at the land for months now, and while the rescue of Belka was a small triumph, it didn't change the fact that the very ground beneath them was dying. "We need to find water, John," Emma said quietly, her words carrying a weight she hadn't meant to let slip. "For the animals. For us." John glanced back at her, his expression shifting from relief to concern as he followed her gaze toward the darkening sky. He knew what she meant. The farm had relied on its wells for years, but with the dry spell dragging on, both of their water sources were starting to show signs of strain. What had once been deep, cool pools of water now seemed shallow and distant, a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen. "We're down to the last of it, Em," he said with a grim tone. "Both wells are nearly dry. If the storm doesn't come soon, we'll have to find another source." Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been trying to avoid thinking about it, but the reality was sinking in now, each passing minute, each beat of her anxious heart. If they didn't find water soon, the animals would suffer. And if the storm didn't bring the rain they so desperately needed, they would be left with nothing but dust and the harsh sun. "I'll check the east well," John continued, his voice practical but low with worry. "Maybe there's a little left, enough to get us through for a couple more days." Emma nodded, her throat tight. The prospect of the east well running dry was terrifying, and she knew what it meant. The east well was the deeper of the two, the one that had never failed them in all the years they had lived there. But now, even it was showing signs of weakness, and if it too ran dry, there was no backup. "I'll go check on the animals," she said, her voice hoarse, as if the air itself had thickened around them. "Make sure they're okay. I'll keep an eye on the water troughs too." John didn't argue. They had no time for that. Time was running out. As Emma made her way back to the barn, her eyes flicked toward the patch of land where the vegetables used to thrive, a few scattered rows of now wilting crops that had once been a source of pride. The garden, once bursting with green, now looked like a forgotten dream, dried up, cracked earth, and leaves curled with thirst. The animals would be the last ones to feel the brunt of the drought, but even they had limits. She found the geese by the fence, their feathers dull, their eyes unfocused, as if they too had sensed the change in the air. The ducks waddled over in slow, tired steps, their usual energy replaced by a listless shuffle. Even the pigs, who usually reveled in the mud, had grown restless, grunting softly as they rooted around in search of anything that might help quench their thirst. Emma walked over to the troughs, checking the water levels. They had been careful, always rationing, always making sure every drop counted. But as she dipped her hand into the shallow trough, the feeling of the last drops of water slipped through her fingers like sand. Her chest tightened. She knew there was nothing left to do but wait for the storm. And as the wind picked up, she felt a sickening sense of foreboding in her gut. The clouds, now closer, hung low and dark, heavy with a threat that was far worse than just rain. Meanwhile, John was at the east well, his hand gripping the rope as he lowered the bucket with a mechanical, practiced motion. The familiar clink of the metal bucket against the stone echoed down the narrow shaft, and for a moment, he thought it would be just like any other day. The water would rise, cool and clear, and everything would be fine. But as the rope went slack, and the bucket didn't reach the bottom, a cold realization began to settle in. John pulled the rope back up, his heart sinking with every turn. When the bucket finally emerged, it was empty. No water. He stared at the dry bucket for a long time, as if hoping the water would suddenly materialize, defy the laws of nature, and fill it to the brim. But it didn't. John let out a breath, half laughing and half sighing in disbelief. He had known this was coming, of course. Deep down, he had known. But to stand there, holding an empty bucket, was something different altogether. It was a weight he hadn't prepared for. The realization hit him harder than he expected. There was no more water. The land was dry, and with the horizon still heavy with clouds, he knew the storm wouldn't bring the relief they needed. The drought wasn't just a temporary setback. It was the reality of their lives now. The only thing that could save them was a miracle, and miracles were few and far between these days. John stood there for a long time, staring down into the dry well, feeling like a fool for not acting sooner, for waiting too long to admit that things had gotten this bad. When he finally made his way back to the house, he found Emma still tending to the animals. She looked up when she saw him approach, her face tight with concern. "I'm afraid it's worse than I thought," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. Emma didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. She had already seen the look in his eyes. "You're right," she said softly, her words carrying the same gravity. "We need help, John, and we need it fast." They stood there for a moment, the reality of their situation settling in around them. But even in the face of such a dire need, neither of them faltered. The drought was relentless, yes, but so were they, and they would find a way to survive. Cliffhanger as Emma turned to face John, she caught something strange in the distance, just on the edge of the dry fields. The faint glimmer of something, almost like a shimmer of water. Could it be? Could there be an answer to their prayers, hidden right beneath their feet, waiting to be discovered? Chapter 6. Old Friends and Forgotten Path. The glimmering light in the distance caught Emma's attention, stirring a flicker of hope deep within her chest. She stared at it for a moment, unsure if it was an illusion created by the heat or something more. The air seemed to tremble, like a mirage, but there was something about it that made her heart race. Perhaps the tiniest shred of possibility, a chance that they weren't completely beyond saving. "John," Emma said, her voice a little sharper than usual. "Do you see that?" John squinted, looking out across the barren fields. First, he didn't see anything, but then his gaze narrowed, and he caught a glint, a faint, shimmering reflection off the ground. "Could be the sun," he said, his tone guarded. "Maybe just the dust playing tricks." Emma shook her head, though she couldn't fully convince herself. There was something too distinct about the gleam of light, like a reflection from water. For a moment, she considered whether it could be another mirage, an illusion that would only make their hopes rise higher before crashing them down. But the idea of finding any sign of water, no matter how small, felt like a lifeline in the desert of their despair. "Even if it's nothing, I think it's worth checking," she said firmly, brushing the beads of sweat from her forehead. "I'll go." John hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew his wife, stubborn, determined, and always ready to face challenges head-on. He couldn't stop her, not when there was a glimmer of hope. "Take care, Emma," he said, his voice low. "We can't afford to waste time." She nodded, already starting to walk toward the distant shimmer. With every step, the land seemed to stretch farther and farther. The cracked earth beneath her feet a painful reminder of just how bad things had become. The air was dry, the wind biting at her face. But there was something new now in her movements, purpose. As Emma walked toward the shimmering light, she couldn't help but think of how they had come to this place. Life here had never been easy, living on a small farm with little more than the land and each other. But there had always been enough. Enough food, enough water, enough of everything that mattered. Until now, the drought had changed everything. The fields were empty, the wells were dry, and no matter how hard she tried to remain optimistic, Emma couldn't ignore the overwhelming truth. They were running out of time. It was during one of these moments of quiet reflection that she heard the sound, soft at first, like a distant rumble, but then growing louder as it approached. A vehicle. She turned, shielding her eyes from the sun as a dusty old truck appeared on the horizon. It wasn't anything new. In fact, Emma recognized the truck almost immediately. It belonged to Ben, an old friend of John's, someone who had been a neighbor for years before he moved away to the nearby town. She couldn't believe her eyes. What was Ben doing here? The truck was old and battered, the engine sputtering with each turn of the wheels. But it was a truck, and it was coming toward her. Ben's truck pulled up beside her with a screech of tires on the dry earth. The door swung open, and Ben stepped out, grinning beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. "Emma, you look like you've been baking in the sun," he called out, his voice thick with both familiarity and concern. "Figured I'd check on you too. Heard about the drought, and thought you might need a hand." Emma blinked, trying to process the sudden appearance of her old friend. Ben hadn't come by in years. She wasn't even sure why he had come now. There was no reason for him to be here, not with the town itself in the grips of the same desperate situation. But he was here, and that was something she hadn't expected. She stepped toward him, gratitude rising up in her chest. "You don't know how much we needed someone," she said, trying to keep the emotion from her voice. "The wells are dry, Ben. The animals are thirsty, and we don't know what to do." Ben's smile faltered as he took in the weariness in her face, the lines of exhaustion deepening beneath her eyes. His gaze flickered toward the barn, then over to the distant land where the crops used to grow. He could see the toll it had taken on her and John. "I can't promise much, but I've got a couple of leads," Ben said, his voice steady, though there was a note of weariness in his tone. "I heard about an old well near the forest. It's a long shot, but it's worth a try." Emma blinked in surprise. She had lived here her whole life and had never heard of any well near the forest. "Old well?" she asked. "I don't know anything about it." Ben chuckled, rubbing his chin. "It's not exactly a well. More like a stream that runs underground. Used to be a place people would go to when their wells ran dry. But that was before your time." Emma's mind raced, trying to recall anything from her childhood. Anything about a stream hidden somewhere beneath the forest floor. Nothing came to mind. But Ben was the kind of man who didn't make wild promises. If he was saying this, there was a real possibility that it could be true. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice a little more urgent than she intended. Ben glanced behind him towards the forest, and then back at her. "It's about 2 miles east, just past the ridge. We'll need to take the truck. It'll be a long walk otherwise. But if there's any water left there, we can use it to get by. Then let's go." Emma didn't need to think twice. Ben's smile returned, though it was tinged with the same exhaustion Emma had been feeling for weeks. "Hold on, Emma. We're in for a long ride." As they bounced along the narrow dirt road toward the forest, Emma's thoughts kept drifting back to the distant shimmer she had seen earlier. Could it have been the reflection of water, as she had hoped? Was it a sign that they were not as desperate as they thought? But there were no more signs. Only the forest ahead, thick with trees, silent in the heavy, dry air. "How far?" she asked, leaning toward Ben, breaking the silence. "Not much further," he said, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "We'll know soon enough." As they approached the ridge, Emma felt her heart race. Was this the answer to their prayers? Could there really be water in these parts? She couldn't allow herself to get her hopes up too high, not after everything they'd been through. But the thought of finding something, anything, that could save them made the exhaustion feel a little less heavy. And then, as they crested the ridge, she saw it. A small, worn-down stone structure. It looked ancient, like it had been abandoned long ago. But the gleam of water, faint but undeniable, caught her eye. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "That's it," Ben said, his voice hushed with awe. Emma's heart leaped. It wasn't a mirage. The stream, the answer to their prayers, was right in front of her. Asterisk cliffhanger asterisk. As they moved toward the stream, Emma's gaze shifted to the trees beyond. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something moving between the trunks. A shadow. A figure. What could it be? Chapter 7. Underground Rivers. The rain that had finally arrived had been a blessing, but the problem was far from solved. The well had collapsed under the weight of the earth, leaving them with nothing but the faint trickle of water that Emma had spotted earlier. But it wasn't enough. They needed more, and the clock was ticking. The animals were thirsty, their once sparkling eyes now dull with dehydration, and the heat was unforgiving. Emma watched as John crouched by the small stream that had started to flow where the well used to be, his brow furrowed in concentration. The water was still there, but it wasn't nearly enough to get them through the coming days. They had tried everything they could think of, digging deeper, expanding the reach of the well, but the earth just refused to give them more. And now, with the rain starting to stop, they were left with uncertainty once again. "We can't let this go on," John muttered, his voice low but steady. His hands were covered in dirt, but he barely seemed to notice, lost in thought as he examined the ground. Emma approached him slowly, wiping the rain from her face with the back of her sleeve. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the toll the last few days had taken on him. She knew he was as frustrated as she was, maybe more. This was the kind of problem they hadn't encountered before. The land had always been kind to them, but now it felt like it was turning against them. "John," she said, kneeling beside him, "what if there's something deeper? Something we haven't found yet?" He looked at her, his eyes thoughtful, and then nodded. "That's what I'm thinking, too. There has to be something more down there. We just need to find it." The idea of digging deeper was daunting. The thought of going any further felt like tempting fate. But they had no other choice. If there was any chance of finding water, it was buried under layers of earth that were stubbornly refusing to give. "We'll start at the edge of the land, where the stream begins," John said, standing up and brushing off his knees. "We'll dig through that area, see if we can find where the water is coming from." Emma stood with him, determination settling into her chest. They had done this before, solved problems, faced down hardship, fought the odds. But this was different. This was something that required patience and a deep trust in the earth beneath their feet. The rain had shown them a hint, but the rest was up to them. They had no idea what they were going to uncover, but they had to try. They worked for hours, the rain now mostly stopped, but the air still thick with moisture. They dug at the edge of the field, breaking through the dry soil, searching for any sign of water beneath the surface. The further they went, the harder the ground became. Their hands were raw, their backs aching, but neither of them complained. They had learned long ago that complaining didn't change anything. All they could do was push forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John's shovel struck something hard. It wasn't rock, but it felt different from the rest of the soil. Emma's heart raced as John cleared away more dirt. He paused, looking up at her with a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "Emma, I think we found something." She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she helped him uncover the object. As the last of the dirt was swept away, Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was a piece of old wood, worn by time and the elements. But beneath it, something glimmered, a faint blue light. It was a small trickle of water, barely more than a stream, but it was unmistakably there. "It's an underground river," Emma whispered, awe in her voice. She couldn't believe it. They had found it, water. Not much, but enough to give them hope. John stood up, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "We'll be able to use this. We'll dig around it, bring the water up. It's not much, but it's something. And right now, that's everything." The moment was almost too good to be true. For the first time in days, Emma allowed herself to believe that everything might turn out all right. She and John had fought the land, fought the drought, and now they had a chance. They weren't beaten yet, not by a long shot, but as they stood there, looking down at the tiny stream of water, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. There always was, and as much as she hoped that this discovery was the end of their troubles, she knew better than to take anything for granted. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Emma said quietly, taking John's hand. "We have a long way to go." John squeezed her hand in return. "One step at a time, Emma. We've always done that." Together, they began to clear away more dirt, expanding the small stream, uncovering the secret of the underground river that had been hidden beneath their feet all along. Chapter 8. The final push. The sky had cleared, but the storm had left its mark on the land. It was no longer a gentle, life-giving rain. It had been a violent downpour that had only compounded their problems. The ground was soggy and heavy, the earth reluctant to let go of its moisture. And yet, amid the exhaustion, amid the endless challenges they had faced over the past weeks, Emma felt something stir within her, an unexpected resolve. John had found the underground river, and now it was time to make it work. The small trickle of water that had given them so much hope needed to be expanded, redirected, brought to the surface. It was a delicate operation. They had to dig carefully, slowly, or they risked losing everything they'd gained. Emma watched as John worked tirelessly, his hands moving through the wet earth with practiced precision. His brow was furrowed, his movements steady but strained. He had never looked so tired. Yet, as always, he never once complained. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. They always had. Emma knew how much this meant to him. It wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving everything they had built. Their home, their animals, their way of life. The thought of losing it all was unbearable. And so they worked side by side, digging, clearing, redirecting the water. As the hours passed, the hole grew deeper, wider, and soon the small stream turned into a steady flow. Emma could hear the difference in the sound of the water, the quiet rushing that had once been so faint, now growing louder. It was a beautiful sound, a sound that meant hope, that meant life. And with it came a surge of relief that Emma hadn't allowed herself to feel until that very moment. John paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, looking at the small trench they had dug to channel the water. He gave Emma a tired smile, but it was a smile full of pride. "It's working," he said, his voice hoarse. "We've done it." Emma nodded, her heart swelling. She couldn't help but feel a sense of awe watching him. She had known him for so many years, had been by his side through every hardship, and yet he still had the ability to surprise her. It was in the way he could hold everything together when it seemed like the world was falling apart. He was strong not just in his hands, but in his heart. They worked until dusk, when the first stars began to appear in the sky. The trench was complete, the water was flowing steadily, and the animals were already starting to gather, sensing the change in the air. John and Emma stood for a moment, watching the water as it cascaded through the narrow channel they had created. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to bring relief. Enough to give them a fighting chance. "I'll go get the animals," Emma said, turning to head back to the barn. John nodded, his exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on the flow. Make sure nothing shifts." Emma walked back toward the barn, her feet heavy with fatigue, but her heart light. As she approached the pens, she could see the animals waiting by the gates, restless, anxious for their water. The cows, the pigs, the chickens, they were all there, looking up at her with expectant eyes. She opened the gate and walked toward the cows first. They were always the most patient of the animals, and they greeted her with quiet curiosity. She ran her hands over their thick fur, murmuring softly to them as she led them to the new water source. They drank eagerly, their large bodies trembling with the relief of it. It was a sight that always filled Emma with peace. One by one, the other animals followed, each receiving their share of water. The geese, the ducks, the rabbits, they all had their moment at the newly formed stream. Emma didn't rush them. She let them take their time, as if they, too, understood the significance of this moment. As she watched the animals drink, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. It wasn't just the water that mattered, it was the way the land had given back. The way the earth had hidden its secrets, waiting for them to uncover it. They had fought for this, and now it was theirs. She glanced up toward the house, where John stood, watching her from a distance. His figure was silhouetted against the fading light, and Emma felt a surge of love for him. They had always worked side by side, and though the years had been long, the bond between them had only grown stronger. Through every hardship, they had weathered it together. And now, standing by their animals, they had come through the worst of it. She walked back toward him slowly, the sound of the animals drinking a gentle rhythm in the background. When she reached him, she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply placed her hand on his arm. He looked down at her, his face softened by the weight of the day. "It's done," he said, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. Emma smiled up at him, her heart full. "Yes, it is. We've done it." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to truly rest in the knowledge that they had overcome the worst. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life on the farm would never be easy. But in this moment, as they stood together in the fading light, they knew that they had fought through it all. And they had won. Chapter 9. Where Hope Grow. The next morning was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that settles deep in the bones after a storm. The land seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something. A sign, perhaps, that it had endured enough. The animals, too, seemed more at peace, no longer pacing restlessly, but instead, they grazed contentedly in the pasture, the water from the small stream now flowing steadily in the background. John and Emma sat on the porch, watching the early light spill across the fields. The air was still thick with the scent of damp earth, but it was a good smell, the smell of rebirth. The land had endured the storm, and now it was beginning to heal. John sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had always been a man of few words, but Emma knew him better than anyone. She could see the exhaustion still in his posture, the tired lines etched into his face, but there was something else there too, something softer, something that said they had made it. "You think the water will hold?" Emma asked quietly, breaking the silence between them. John nodded, but there was a cautiousness to his answer. "It should. The underground stream is holding steady, and as long as the rain doesn't stop again too soon, we'll be okay. But we'll need to keep an eye on it." Emma leaned back in her chair, letting the warmth of the morning sun soak into her skin. The storm had left them with much more than just water. It had given them a renewed sense of purpose. There was work still to be done, certainly, but for the first time in weeks, Emma allowed herself to think of something else. She glanced at John, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did well. We did well." John didn't answer right away, but his eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The long hours of work, the sweat, the frustration. It had all led to this moment, where they could finally take a breath and look at what they had accomplished. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. "I didn't do it alone," he said softly, his voice gruff with the weight of unspoken gratitude. "We did it together. Always have." Emma smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. They had been through so much, but in the end, it was their shared strength that had seen them through. The animals were beginning to gather by the stream again, the cows first, their large bodies moving slowly but purposefully toward the water. Emma and John both stood up, watching them with quiet admiration. They had fought so hard for this. Their home, their animals, their life together, and now it was finally paying off. As the cows drank, Emma felt a shift inside her, a feeling that the worst was truly behind them. It wasn't just the water they had found, but something deeper, something that had always been there, their unshakable bond. They had faced the worst of the drought together, fought through the days when it seemed like there was no hope left, and they had come out on the other side stronger. The first few drops of rain began to fall again, light at first, but steady. Emma looked up, her heart lifting. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The earth had begun to listen again. "It's like the land knows," she said, her voice soft as she watched the sky change. John followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as the rain began to fall more steadily. "Maybe it does," he said. "Maybe it just needed a little time to remember." The rain fell steadily throughout the day, nourishing the land in ways that only rain could. It wasn't the kind of storm that would undo all of their hard work, but it was enough to ensure that the underground stream would continue to flow, that the land would recover. That evening, as the sun began to set and the air cooled, Emma and John found themselves sitting in the barn, the soft glow of the lantern casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The animals had been fed, the water had been replenished, and now there was nothing left to do but rest. John sat in his usual spot, leaning back against the wall, his eyes half closed. Emma sat across from him, watching the flicker of the lantern's flame as it danced in the still air. The silence between them was comfortable, as it always was. They didn't need words to know how much they meant to each other. "I think we'll make it through," Emma said softly, more to herself than to John. John opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. His expression was tired, but his smile was genuine, the kind of smile that only came after a hard day's work. "We always do." Emma leaned back, letting out a long sigh of contentment. She looked around the barn at their animals, at the cows, the pigs, the chickens, the ducks, all of them content, safe, and well. For the first time in a long while, she felt that familiar peace wash over her. They had come through the storm together, and there was no storm that would break them. They were ready for whatever came next. And then, as if the earth itself was joining in their quiet victory, the rain began to fall more heavily. Emma stood up and moved to the barn door, watching as the droplets hit the ground, creating small ripples in the earth. The land was alive again, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt like everything was as it should be. The worst was over. They had made it through the drought, through the heat, and the hardships. And as she looked at John, standing beside her, she knew that as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't face. Chapter 10. The rain. The morning broke with a soft, golden light filtering through the trees. Emma stretched in her chair, the weight of the past weeks still heavy in her bones but softened by the relief of the rain. The land was finally giving back, the earth that had been cracked and thirsty for so long now drinking deeply, soaking up the moisture as if it had been starved. John sat beside her, his hand on the old wood of the porch railing, his eyes distant as he took in the scene before him. The stream they had uncovered the day before was flowing freely now, and the animals were already grazing contentedly in the pasture. It felt like the world had shifted, like the storm had passed and, with it, all the weight that had threatened to crush them. "I think it'll be all right now," Emma said, her voice soft but sure. "We've done it, John. We've survived." John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the fields. Emma followed him, her steps slow but steady, as if the rain had somehow infused her with a new sense of purpose. The earth beneath their feet was soft, and the air smelled of wet soil, fresh grass, and something else too, a sense of renewal. It was as if the land itself was taking a deep breath, preparing for a new season. John placed his hand on Emma's shoulder, his weathered fingers gentle. "It was never about surviving," he said quietly. "It was about living. We've always known how to survive, but it's living that makes all the difference." Emma looked up at him, her eyes warm, full of unspoken gratitude. In all the years they'd spent together, she'd come to understand that John didn't need grand gestures or elaborate plans. He needed honesty, hard work, and love. And in return, he had always given her the same. The storm had passed, and with it, the worst of the drought. The water was flowing, the crops would grow, and the animals had everything they needed. It was the start of something new, a fresh chapter in a story they had lived together for so long. They hadn't just weathered the storm. They had fought it, faced it head-on, and emerged stronger. As they stood there together, watching the rain fall softly on the earth, Emma felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a quiet happiness that filled her chest, knowing that, against all odds, they had made it through. They had saved their home, their animals, and each other. John's hand slid down her arm, his fingers gently brushing hers. "We've built something here," he said softly. "It's ours. And no matter what happens next, we'll face it together. Like we always do." The weight of those words settled deep in Emma's heart. He was right, of course. They had always faced everything together. And as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't endure. The land, the animals, the challenges, they were all just part of the story. But the love between them, the quiet understanding, was the foundation of it all. As the rain continued to fall, a soft pattering sound on the roof and the ground, Emma stepped into the barn to check on the animals. The cows were resting in their stalls, content after their drink from the stream. The pigs were napping, their little grunts the only sound in the quiet barn. The geese and ducks waddled around, still pecking at the ground, but in a way that suggested a deep satisfaction. They were all safe, well-fed, and cared for. John followed her inside, and together they moved through the barn, checking on each animal, making sure they had everything they needed. There was a peace in the air now, a tranquility that had been absent for so long. Later, as the sun began to set, the two of them sat together in the barn, the evening light casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. The fire in the stove crackled softly, filling the air with the comforting scent of wood and smoke. The rain had slowed, but the earth still held onto the coolness, the promise of more to come. John leaned back against the wall, his eyes closing for a moment as he let out a long sigh. Emma sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. It was a quiet evening, but there was no place in the world Emma would rather be. They had come through the hardest of times, and now they could simply rest. "We've made it," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and relief. John's arm slipped around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "Yes, we have. Together." And as they sat in the fading light, the animals around them content, the house warm with the soft glow of the fire, Emma knew that life would never be perfect. There would always be storms, droughts, and challenges to face. But she also knew that, no matter what, she would always have John by her side. And that, more than anything, was all she needed. The world outside might be unpredictable, but within the walls of their little farm, Emma felt a peace that she had longed for. They had fought for their home, their animals, and their life together. And now, in the stillness of the evening, they could simply be. And, as they looked out across the fields one last time before the night settled in, Emma saw something she hadn't noticed before. A small patch of green, where the grass was beginning to grow again, fresh and vibrant. It was the first sign of new life, the first promise of spring. As John squeezed her hand, Emma smiled softly, knowing that the worst was behind them, and that the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape.